Welcome, Sangha. Take a minute and look around the room, see who's here. Hopefully not too soggy tonight from coming out in the rain. And Zoomers, we have 20 people on Zoom. So glad everybody's here. My name is Thia Powers, and I'm your Dharma leader for the evening. So 2 or so years ago, we were right in the belly of COVID, and this Sangha didn't meet in the chapel. We met everybody on Zoom. We were doing what everybody was doing, trying to figure out how to keep things going without much of a plan. I think it blindsided everybody. And we had a West Coast Dharma leader Zoom in. Her name was Tuare Salah, and she is a formidable presence. She's a wonderful Dharma teacher who used to be a prosecuting attorney. She can make her case with the Dharma. So her talk that night was about the Brahma Viharas, also known as the divine abodes. And they are ways of being that we can cultivate. We have a class coming up on that. And those ways of being are to be a person of loving kindness, a person that shares joy with other people, not just your own joy, but relishes when other people have good in their life. It's being a person of compassion and a person that has equanimity. They can bounce back. They don't get too low or too high. They have a broad bandwidth emotionally. Is equanimity is how I like to think of it. Now, capacity is an indication of how much we can hold or how much we can produce in society. We often measure an employee's capacity. And so it's kind of like the way we build resistance during challenging times, or how we might learn to grow our patience during a difficult relationship. And this is the sense that I want to approach this topic tonight in: the capacity of compassion and the capacity of right speech. And I'm partnering them together because that's what I've been trying to figure out in my life lately. And so, we talk about what we're living and what we most need to learn. You may wonder what these two have to do with each other, but they really do go hand in hand, just like so many wisdom practices do. So the story begins again with recent events in my neighborhood. You guys are going to feel like you know everybody in the hood eventually. And this story starts with an elderly rabbit that is a pet that belongs to some friends of ours. And I apologize to my KM group because they have heard this story a lot, helping me process things. Walker is a chinchilla rabbit. He's really beautiful being. He's got the softest fur you've ever touched. And this little guy has spent most of his life in a hutch, about 3 by 5 feet with a wire bottom. And his feet have not had a lot of opportunity to touch the earth. He hasn't spent a lot of time running or eating fresh clover. He is a loved bunny, but this is the situation he finds himself in. And so recently, Walker entered a period of decline, and it began to be apparent that he could no longer sit up, that his hind legs were not working great, and he seemed to be experiencing pain. He was kind of trembly, and if you tried to pet him, he might bite you, which was unusual. So our friends had noticed this, but they just weren't doing much in response. And a long story short is that John and I got involved with taking care of this rabbit because this was a single mom with 2 young kids, and Walker was kind of lower on the list. So we got involved with caring for this old rabbit, and it quickly became a heart-wrenching task. I'll spare you the details, but this little guy had lost his ability to move about in this cage. At this point, he had begun soiling himself, and he was going blind from an infection in his body. So it was a difficult situation. And even though I had been feeding him and caring for him for months at this point, he was not my rabbit. And so I couldn't really take him to the vet, or I don't know. I was trying to figure out what was right speech, how much did I say to these people about this little rabbit, and the compassion that I was feeling felt like it was ripping my heart out to go down and see this every day. So there were extenuating circumstances that were causing this little guy to be neglected. And, there often are, which is why we should never judge people, because there's always stuff going on behind the scenes that we don't know about. That was the case here. So here's this perfect storm of these deep feelings of compassion as I'm being with this creature, and he's suffering daily. And I want this friendship to be intact with my neighbor. This is a person that I see frequently and is in my life. And her plate was already full. And I'm trying to figure out, how do I talk about this without insinuating that she's a bad rabbit mom or something like that. So I realized that in this very room, there may be debate about this, about the idea of maybe when to consider ending the life of an animal, a pet that is slowly dying. How do you make that call? How do you know when they're ready? Or you may be completely against it. One of the precepts in Buddhism is not to kill. So we're in some really strange territory in my heart now. And so I'm trying to navigate these choppy waters. I'm a little bit angry. I'm feeling this deep compassion. I'm trying to be patient and see how things unfold. And I'm trying not to be judgmental, which it's just, that's hard sometimes. All of this came with this particular situation. And at some point, I simply couldn't go see this little rabbit anymore. And then I began to feel guilty. He was mostly eating kibble, which is a high nutrition, sort of a pellet food. But rabbits, they like green stuff. They like alive stuff. And so he was not getting salads. I couldn't lift his little trembling body out of the cage and witness these infections. It felt like it was tearing my heart out. And so this experience started several months ago. And like I said, I've been processing this with my KM group. And so it became obvious, how does the Dharma support me in this situation? What are the boundaries of compassion, and how should I speak about this to my neighbor, or should I even say anything? So I began to find out some interesting things. And this was in a neuroscientific group that was studying compassion. It's a book that I purchased that I'll mention in a minute, that there are distinctions in compassion that can be measured in the brain. The scientific community calls compassion empathy. And bear with me now, because I'm going to get a little geeky here, but there are 3 major categories of compassion, according to neuroscience. The first one is cognitive. The second one is emotional. And the last one is called empathic concern. So the differences are easy to spot in the brain because different parts of the brain are lighting up. The first kind of compassion is called cognitive empathy, and it uses mostly the thinking mind because we all have an ability to understand another person's perspective or emotional state from a thinking place. This is also called perspective taking and is used in neuro-linguistic programming. So cognitive therapy is an important skill to have. It can also be used in tactical ways that don't necessarily involve a lot of heart energy. The second kind of compassion is called emotional empathy. This is when we have the heart ability to respond to another's distress. It's sort of wired into mammals, actually, that we usually respond with an appropriate emotion or action if we let ourselves. Sometimes we feel like, oh, I'm not going to get involved. It's complicated. But oftentimes we naturally comfort, console, and bear witness to our friends in our community, sometimes to complete strangers, in order to ease distress. Now, this third kind of compassion is that science is finding is called empathic concern. And this is the most powerful and the most congruent with the welfare of someone, including bunnies, in need. Empathic concern is the most mature kind of empathy, and it includes the first two, the emotional and the cognitive. But it also gives us access to an entire constellation of feelings. It allows us to feel sadness, tenderness, grief, sympathy, and most importantly, here's the distinction, the big distinction. With this kind of empathic concern, which is a wiser, more mature kind of compassion, we have the ability to titrate all these emotions that we feel, that we are not overwhelmed by these emotions. Like when I was ready to throw in the towel, like I just can't, it hurts too much, I can't do it. So I had some growing up to do with my compassion. You know, I wasn't able to titrate. With this one, we can honor the feelings, but they don't run the show. So that's wisdom that's guiding us in the way to respond. This comes from a really interesting book called Altered Traits, which is a play on altered states because it's a book about meditation. But the premise of the book is that when we have altered states during meditation, oftentimes we open our eyes and the bell rings and we go on our way, and then we're right back into our patterns. This book posits that if we can meditate more consistently for longer, go on retreats like the 10-day retreats that we were talking about a minute ago, and find a teacher that is further down the path that we are, sometimes quite a bit further down the path that's more helpful, then we can actually alter the way we behave. Our personality traits will change to include some of these Brahma Viharas, that we just act this way. It's natural that we act from joy and compassion, equanimity, and loving kindness. So full disclosure, I've not read the entire book, but these are high-level studies, and I do recommend it. It's authored by Daniel Goleman and Richard Davidson. So taking this possibility to heart that there were many different kinds of suffering, well, there are many different kinds of suffering, many different kinds of compassion. This has helped me with my own practice, sometimes to be able to sit with things that I feel like I can't sit with, like the fact that the world either seems to be on fire or flooding or in a drought, or, the world just seems to be in great distress right now. And if I put too much energy into that, it's hard for me to hold. So it's not only helped me with sitting with that kind of global distress, but it's also helped me be with Walker, to be able to see him again and hold the fact that I can stop contracting around an already difficult situation, that me bringing anxiety just makes it worse. So I learned how to practice what some teachers call wet metta. And I love that term because dry metta, or when we practice loving kindness, which we do at the end of every session that we have here Wednesday night, sometimes we're just not feeling it. But we are going through the motions because we're wanting to put the training wheels on so that we can remember that one day the training wheels come off and we automatically begin to have a heart response to that is deeply felt and that feels very real. And that's sometimes called wet metta. So we send loving kindness with a raw heart. This helps us open to the suffering of others. In other words, Walker's suffering has become a doorway for me to be willing to feel distress more deeply, not just for him, but to realize how many creatures, and I don't know if you're on next door, but there's so many creatures that are lost on there. That's all I see are lost cats and dogs, including us in this room. Everybody here has some kind of anxiety, discomfort, limitation, disappointment. You name your flavor of suffering. There's plenty to go around. So just being with our own suffering is where we start. And then beginning to be with the suffering of the people that are causing us the suffering that we feel is another great place to start. It's a wonderful way to practice. So the Dharma not only teaches us that suffering is inherent in life, but it tells us that when we cling to the idea that it should be otherwise, then we just suffer more. So that led me to ask myself, is the Dharma telling me that this rabbit should, in fact, be suffering? So no, I don't believe that, but I did come to the conclusion that I simply happened to be on the front row of a very small theater in which I got to view the cause and effect of a little creature being caged for many years without a lot of exercise and maybe not the highest quality nutrition. And the body was taking its natural course of aging and illness and beginning to fall apart. That perspective makes sense. It isn't pretty, but it is realistic given the circumstances, and it did somehow ease my pain. I wasn't clinging and wanting things to be different than they were. I was able to just witness him, be a friend, and try to give him as many moments of small joy and connection as possible. Also, right about this time, an article came out in the New York Times, this was last weekend, about Matthew Ricard, who is a famous Buddhist monk, who happens to be the author of books on animal rights, happiness, and wisdom. He has been referred to as the happiest man alive, much to his chagrin, due to studies of his brain showing enlarged areas of contentment, of learning and attention, and reduced activity in the areas that process stress, and not just a little bit, but a lot. So this article further encouraged me because in the article, Ricard says, mature compassion must be universal. It cannot be a selective kind of thing, as in compassion for you, but certainly not for you. Our mature, developed over time compassion is a capability to broadcast compassion, to understand how much ignorance and suffering is behind so many situations that it only makes sense just to blanket the community, blanket the earth, just to send out, be a little compassion generator, a little compassion engine, if we can. When I was a Bible student decades ago, it always touched me that Jesus was quoted as he was being crucified as saying, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." Who says that when they're being crucified? Only a person suffused with mature, loving kindness, empathy, compassion, and wisdom. So here's a good question. Why must true compassion be universal? Why? What difference does it make? Ricard says, because compassion is not a moral judgment on a person. It is the acknowledgement or understanding that ignorance, anger, and delusion are the factors behind suffering and folks that cause suffering. People that knowingly cause suffering are in the grips of anger, ignorance, delusion, greed. These are the poisons in Buddhism. And for that simple reason alone, these folks deserve our compassion. We all experience those. I know I do. So if you're thinking about that now and thinking, well, I can't do that. I can't wish well to this person, especially the evildoers who are operating on a global scale. Ricard says you also cannot master playing the piano right away. These skills take time, and maybe we deserve a little compassion for ourselves for this struggle with creating the grown-up, full-on, hardcore compassion. The last thought I want to bring to you tonight comes from Nikki Miraforgi. Her article on right speech in the May issue of Lion's Roar struck a chord. Opens by saying words are a powerful thing. Some of you know that in the Buddha Dharma, right speech is taught many, many times and involves employing these guidelines. Is it a good time to say this? Is it timely, in other words? Is it the truth? Am I being gentle? Is it going to benefit the person and or the greater good? Is it beneficial? And lastly, am I speaking with an intention of goodwill or merely to benefit myself? Determining the motive can be tricky. And even if all these things are check, 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 everything's good, we might still choose to wait or keep silent out of compassion for others or for a potential divisive impact in our community. That's why it made it so hard for me to say something to my neighbor. Compassion is the driver here to determine if our words will create more suffering or less suffering. These reflections all came to me just at the right time. I was able to be with my friend, the human one, and be a witness to her decision to allow Walker to be aided in leaving his body, to end his, by then, extreme suffering. And I realize this is potentially controversial. There are no black and white rules around this kind of thing. But in my heart, I feel good about this. It's done. The KM group doesn't have to hear about it anymore. And I think it unfolded, I guess, in the best way that it could. So to close us out tonight, I'd like to go back to the world's happiest man, Matthew Ricard. When he was asked for the 3 secrets of happiness, he responded with compassion and with skillful speech. And he said, first of all, there's no secret. There is no secret. Second of all, there are not 3 points. And third, this practice takes a whole lifetime, and it's the most worthy thing you can possibly do. Thank you for your ears, for your hearts, for showing up. And